Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Dimitris Papadimitriou. I'm the director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Very warm welcome to all of you. Today's event is the last in a series of very busy schedule of events we run at the center here. We are delighted that we are joined by two excellent speakers, and I will introduce them to you in a minute. The center is brings together three universities of Greater Manchester. Of course, the University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, and the University of Chester. It brings expertise from an interdisciplinary perspective, from political science, economics, cultural studies, and so on. We encourage all of you to join us and follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. You will get updates on all of the things that we put together throughout the year. But no event is bigger than today, and it is on a topic that perhaps is not the happiest, but an important one nevertheless. In the last few months, a lot of things have changed in the European security architecture. A lot of certainties have had to be revisited. A lot of soul searching and head scratching about the future of European security and what the European Union within it can do to shape it. To discuss this very important issue, we have invited Nathalie Tocci, a very well-known scholar in European foreign policy. Nathalie has had a very strong background both in academic research. She's currently based at the Harvard Kennedy School. She holds an honorary professorship at the University of Tübingen, and she has a very long list of publications, 6 books dealing with various aspects of European security, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. She has also served as a special advisor to 2 high representatives for foreign policy in the EU, both Federica Mogherini and more recently Josep Borrell. So someone who can approach this issue from both an academic perspective, but also with a very good insight of the practitioner side of things. So thank you very much for coming, Federica. We're delighted to have you on board. To discuss Federica's, Nathalie's opening address, we have Dimitris Kourkoulas, who is also a very well-known figure in European foreign policy broadly defined. Dimitris has been the deputy minister of foreign affairs in Greece between 2012 and 2015. As it happened, he was chairing the European presidency during the very early stages of the Ukrainian conflict. But he has also served in many important European positions during a very distinguished career in Brussels. He has served in 2 post-war zones, including as a EU ambassador in Lebanon and in Bosnia. He was also EU ambassador to Bulgaria during the country's preparations for accession into the European Union. And in the 1990s, he has held senior positions in the European Commission, particularly dealing with EU enlargement. So 2 very distinguished people among us today. Thank you for coming to, Dimitris, and we're delighted to have you here. Just in terms of the format of the events, for those who are joining us, Nathalie will start the discussion with an opening speech of 25 minutes or so, Dimitris will then provide a discussion of about 10 minutes, and we will then open the floor to discussions, particularly from the audience. We encourage all of you to submit your questions on the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen. My colleague, Dr. Paul Tobin, who is also the Deputy Director of the Center, will collate these questions and put them to the audience. Thank you very much for coming on board, Paul. Also great to see you. Again, thanks to everybody for being here. And without any further ado, Nathalie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitri, and it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to actually have this discussion with you and with Dimitri and with everyone else on this call. And so, indeed, in order to sort of make sure that we favor as much as possible discussion, I will try not to bore you for too long, and really kind of take the remarks that I'll be making over the next few minutes as really a set of ideas open for discussion. So in thinking about the context that we're in today, I find it useful to try and map where is it that we've come from, what we have gone through, and where is it that we may therefore be today, and moving forward, where could we end up? And I kind of looking back at the period essentially between the end of the Cold War and today, it seems to me that both in terms of the international system, but then also in terms of European security, including European integration, we have really moved in three successive phases. So I would say phase one, which, one could loosely, there are no kind of clear cutoff points, but one can loosely point to the period which essentially began with the end of the Cold War up until, I would say, 2008, 2009, and I'll get into why I pick those dates as reference points. I would say that first phase was really an age of idealism. It was an age in which we thought this was the time of the liberal international order, a time in which the European Union, and not only the European Union, NATO expanded eastwards. This was about the reconciliation and reunification of Europe. But it was also that liberal international order in which universalism and the idea of universal values were really very prominent. And the idea was that indeed we were living in the end of history. There was an inexorable march towards the affirmation of liberal values, which were understood as being universal values. And in many respects, the responsibility, or so it was understood, of powers like the European Union was really that of assisting this diffusion of liberal and in the European kind of interpretation, European norms and values in surrounding regions. Be these surrounding regions that would eventually end up within the European Union, i.e. the enlargement countries, be these countries that were expected perhaps not quite to enter the European Union, namely the neighborhood countries for which forms of quote-unquote enlargement light were foreseen, but be it even countries beyond this geography. And of course, Russia comes to mind in this respect. And in that period, the notion that there would be a single European space from Lisbon to Vladivostok that would be a space in which essentially there would be a freedom to exchange, goods and services and ideas and people and whatnot. And as I said, it was really a phase in which, if you think of it, universal and universal values and the idea that we knew what history held for us was really quite, in retrospect, a striking period, because it was, a period in which there was a level of certainty about what the future held in store, which came as a product of perhaps the most incredible failure of academia itself in terms of predicting the future, right? I mean, you know, no one predicted the end of the Cold War, right? And yet, although we completely failed to predict the end of the Cold War, immediately afterwards, we now knew what the future had in store, and it was the end of history. And you know, this really, and I point all of this out because, you know, this is a period like, you know, yourself, Dimitri, I mean, probably other Dimitri started a little bit before us, but this is when we started our professional life, you know, and this was really the world that we belonged to. I mean, you know, this was really the Europe that we belonged to. Now, making the transition to around, I would say, 2008, 2009, you start noticing the way in which that age of idealism started gradually tilting into what I would define as an age of pragmatism. Now, to an extent, that pragmatism was a welcome change. And why do I say it? Particularly at the height of that age of idealism, we saw the way in which those ideals, those values were completely distorted. I mean, you know, think about the height of neoconservatism in the United States, the very notion that, you know, we, the West here in this case, I mean, bombed countries in order to make them democratic. Of course, that was not the reason why it was done, but the narrative was very much ideologized. So all of a sudden, this pushback against values, in a sense, against that distortion of values, to an extent was a welcome, in a sense, return to, in a sense, a reality that was more real. Not more realist, but more realistic, if you see what I mean. And this, of course, as I said, it was, you know, part of that broader international context. This had to do with also the change from the Bush II administration onto the first, especially Obama administration. And we as Europeans, essentially in that phase, we kind of struggled a little bit, you know. I mean, it really took a while for us to kind of figure out who we were. I mean, we knew who we were in that age of idealism. It took us a while to kind of figure out who we were in that age of pragmatism. And yet we had to do it because the world was changing. You know, the age of pragmatism, and the reason why I say 2008, 2009 is not just because I'm thinking about the United States, is the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis, and then of course the Eurozone crisis internationally, was also the time, if you think back, also the way in which the international debate developed, in which we started talking about multipolarity. So the world was no longer, and it would no longer be simply dominated by the United States, that unipolar moment within which the European Union essentially was embedded as the soft side, if you like, of American hard power. It was an age in which different powers were emerging or re-emerging. There was the emergence of China, the re-emergence of Russia, the whole debate on the BRICS countries at that time. And it was because, of course, the global financial crisis, in a sense, signaled a relative, not absolute, of course, but a relative decline of the West and the emergence or re-emergence of alternative powers. And these different powers did not necessarily share the same values, right? And so pragmatism was, in a sense, a necessary reaction to a more realistic understanding of the way in which the world was changing. Now, it doesn't mean to say that the world in that phase was becoming an illiberal world, because liberal powers obviously continued to be there, but it was certainly becoming a more non-liberal world, meaning a world in which liberal and illiberal powers would live, coexist, clash, compete, what have you. Now, the other reason, of course, why I think 2008 is an important turning point, looking at it from a European standpoint, is also, in retrospect, because of the significance of Russia's war in Georgia, the South Ossetia war. Again, you know, now it is, quote unquote, easier to see the writing on the wall that was there back then. Back then, we didn't quite see it. I mean, we should have already understood it the year before, meaning in the 2007 Putin speech at the Munich Security Conference. We didn't get it. We didn't get it in 2008, but looking at what is happening now, you very clearly see the turning point in terms of Russia's own understanding of itself, and therefore its understanding of itself on the European continent and beyond, as really kind of marking a turning point around that time. And it was very much connected, of course, to not only that broader international context in which other powers were rising or re-rising, the reading that Russia gave of the relative decline of the West, the moral corruption of the liberal West, and also because, and here we're getting beyond 2008, 2009, but you know, 2010, 11, 12, this weakness of the West, and in particular this weakness of the European Union, that I think Russia in those years increasingly came to the conclusion that this was a failed project. It was a failed project that would inevitably collapse. You know, I was struck in all those years, you know, particularly in, I would say, you know, the post 2014 period. So the post annexation of Crimea period, war in Eastern Ukraine, but also, of course, all of this coinciding with, on the one hand, so what was happening in Eastern Europe, but also in the problems that the EU itself internally was having, the Eurozone crisis, the so-called migration crisis, the movement that then eventually led to the Brexit referendum, and the conviction that many had in Russia in those years that all of this was incontrovertible proof that the EU was on the verge of collapse. And again, this is really something that in retrospect is far easier to read than it was obviously while we were in the midst of it. But I think in retrospect, it was very clear. Now, what I think also marked this age of pragmatism, as I would define it, is that pragmatism cut both ways, right? So pragmatism meant that we had to remove, and this was also very much the, if you like, quote unquote, philosophy that that was imbued in the EU global strategy, where we talked about principled pragmatism. And it was a pragmatism, as I said, that cut both ways. Just to look at it in terms of what this meant for Russia and EU policy towards Russia, it meant, on the one hand, that you've got to take off your rose-tinted glasses, and there will not be this wonderful space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and look at how Russia is behaving, and therefore you've got to push back, and therefore defense on the one hand, sanctions, if you like, on the other. So this was a pragmatic response to a geopolitical environment which was very clearly hardening. But pragmatism in those years also cut the other way. And therefore the belief that, well, you know, here we are, we share a same continent, right, with Russia. And therefore we have to find ways of engaging, perhaps selectively engaging with Russia on areas of common interest, whether this is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, whether this is the Middle East peace process, whether this is climate. Now, in fairness, I think that one has to recognize that in the years leading up to now, the 24th of February, that agenda for selective engagement started narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. I mean, you know, I remember by the time we got to the autumn of last year, that essentially, I would say that the only thing left on that selective engagement agenda was trying to see whether one could do anything together on climate change, the energy transition, because Russia was kind of, particularly after the Fit for 55 package was published, very worried about the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so this was really the only area, I would say, where there was still an element of interest in engagement. But the field really started narrowing. But as I said, I think what's interesting about that phase, which I would put, as I said, you know, around 2008, 2009, up until the 24th of February, was pragmatism emerging in different shapes and forms, which was in many respects a complicated endeavor for the European Union that had understood itself as a normative project and had to come to terms, in a sense, with the world which was big, bad, and ugly. Now, here we are, and here I move to the last set of points, which I'm going to elaborate on a little bit more because they're about the here and the now, about what phase are we in now. Now, I think that having moved from the age of idealism to the age of pragmatism, we have now entered, I'm going to say something that's a little bit obvious, but it's not as obvious as it sounds when I first say it, the age of war. Now, what does this age of war mean? I mean, it does not simply mean the obvious thing, there is a war in Ukraine. Yeah, obviously there is a war in Ukraine. I mean something, in a sense, much deeper than this. I mean that we are in a phase in which we have exited, essentially, you know, 8 decades of post-war era, to a phase in which we have entered a pre-war era. Now, by definition, we don't have a crystal ball, and we don't know whether that pre-war era ends up in a war, meaning a third world war, but we cannot exclude it. And if you think of it, the implications that this has for the European project are momentous. And they're momentous because the European project was born in that post-war era. What does it mean to be a European Union in a pre-war era? I don't think any of us really have the answer to this question, because we have to almost reinvent ourselves in many respects, because that international context has changed so profoundly. And I think there's another sort of deep implication about this pre-war era, which is the fact, and I know I'm going to sound terribly pessimistic in this lecture. Hopefully Dimitris is not going to be as pessimistic as I am. But I really struggle to imagine how what we are living through today can somehow settle into a new Cold War. And the reason why I think that a new Cold War is a widely optimistic scenario. I just cannot imagine how it could magically turn out that way. And the reason why I say it is that the Cold War, a bit like the European Union, was born in that post-war era. The Cold War was fought between two adversaries, namely the United States and the Soviet Union, that fought on the same side of the hot war, meaning the Second World War. To somehow, now there is a hot war which is going on, which is, of course, is the war in Ukraine, and the global powers are on opposite sides of that hot war. So to somehow imagine that all of this is going to, in a few months' time, settle into a steady state in which there is simply, quote unquote, simply a new Iron Curtain, I find it a widely optimistic scenario. I can't quite imagine how that would play out. And this is, as you know, the second reason why I think being in an age of war has such profound implications for the European Union. Now, trying to sort of dig a little bit deeper into what might these implications be, and also how do these implications, in a sense, loop us back in some respects to that age of idealism, but in a profoundly different context. That age of idealism was one in which we, as I said, assumed that our norms and values would simply spread to the rest of the world. No, that ain't gonna happen, not anytime soon, right? In an age of war, if you think of it, values return very much front and center of the discussion. You know, this war in Ukraine is actually a war over values. I mean, it is a war about the existence of Ukraine and the existence of Ukraine understood as a civic nation, because Ukraine, in a sense, can't really understand itself in terms that are not civic, because once you go for, in a sense, an ethno-linguistic understanding of the nation, it becomes, frankly speaking, a little bit complicated to define yourself in clear opposition, if you like, to Russia. So necessarily, Ukraine has to understand itself, and its nationalism has to be civic in nature, which obviously creates a very deep connection to the whole notion of democracy. And so again, values being very much front and center of the agenda, and this notion, which I think really resonates amongst Europeans, of, in a sense, Ukraine being on the front line in a war which is also really about us. So this kind of brings back to the core of the European Union this notion of values. And how does it play out in different policy domains? Well, very clearly and very explicitly, it has brought back, I would say, and I'd love to hear Dimitris' comments on this, it's brought back enlargement to the political agenda. You know, enlargement was a policy that belonged to that age of idealism, right? It was basically, I would say, more or less forgotten during the age of pragmatism. Not officially so, but unofficially, you know, we knew that the enlargement of the Western Balkans was not really going anywhere, not to even mention Turkey. It was basically it had been a political project in the 1990s, early 2000s. And precisely because it was a political project back then, although it was dressed in technical clothing, but the minute in which the politics changed in that age of pragmatism, enlargement as a project also sort of withered away. Now enlargement is very much back on the agenda, precisely as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, and of course the discussion about Georgia and Moldova, etc. But, and I don't have an answer to the question, what does it mean? Is the assumption that we're going to do enlargement in the way in which we did it in the 1990s and early 2000s? Are we talking about something different? I mean, you know, what does enlargement mean in an age of war? And that's, I think, a first question which is very much worth reflecting on. The second aspect is, again, something which is very intimately connected to the values discussion, which is everything that revolves around asylum and migration. We know that in that age of pragmatism, which of course was also the age of nationalist populism within the European Union, you know, we weren't exactly very strong on values, were we, as Europeans? I mean, it was a pretty sorry show, frankly speaking. Now that there is this kind of, you know, embrace of Ukrainian refugees, exactly as there should be, is this something which is simply going to close back in the sense that it will not be extended in terms of solidarity towards anyone else? How are we going to react, for instance, when migrant waves are actually going to increase as a result of the food crisis, as a result of this war, coming from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, etc. Question mark. Are we going to be able to galvanize not only the sense of solidarity, but also the refound sense of unity on these themes, particularly towards Eastern European countries, which of course had been the main, frankly speaking, problem when it comes to this particular topic, to actually make that step forward in integration towards a common asylum and migration policy? Again, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think that is the question that that is a key question that one has to address. Then I think as a third aspect, which is very worth discussing, is everything that falls into the energy and the climate box. Now, already pre-war, so already in a sense during the pandemic, the EU had refound a narrative, in my view, through the green agenda. Having lost its mojo during the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, migration, I mean, it had lost a story to tell. It refound a very powerful story to tell by talking about the energy transition, climate, etc. both internally as a union and in terms of its also external identity towards the rest of the world. Now here we are in the midst of war at a time in which energy security is very much back on the agenda. And energy security in the here and now, of course, is a very fossil story. So this is basically about finding alternative sources, diversifying, etc. And you find alternative sources, and so energy security is back in that traditional sense, in the way in which we had very much forgotten, frankly speaking, particularly between 2014 and I would say around September, October of last year, when energy prices started rising. So energy security is back, and yet energy transition is in. So how do we reconcile those two agendas? It is clear that there is a time frame to it. I mean, there is an immediate term in which you basically need to find other sources, but then actually, if you're serious about the transition, that somehow has to morph into something else. But what is the timing for that to happen? How is it practically done? I think, again, opens another set of extremely important questions. And then very finally, and then I'll stop, is everything that falls into the security and defense box. So again, a set of very complicated questions in this age of war. In an age of war, you can't afford to have academic discussions about, EU and NATO and the relationship between the two. I mean, we are in war, right? I mean, we can't afford to kind of be, sort of too conceptual about it. But what does it mean in practice? Well, it means that probably operationally, you need to use what is there, what works, and what works is NATO. I mean, we can't be fussy about it, right? At the same time, you say, well, fine, great, NATO. Well, great, because there's someone called Joe Biden sitting in the White House today and his administration. But what if there was someone called Donald Trump? And what if that someone is going to come back? So as Europeans in the midst of war, we have to at once use what we have, and what we have is NATO, and yet at the same time, try and build something else alongside it. But again, what is the mix between these two things? A set of questions, I think, to be addressed. I've spoken far too much, so I will stop here, and I'm now really looking forward to what Dimitri has to say.
Okay, thanks very much, Nathalie. You gave us a lot of stuff to consider, and certainly a lot of things that will come up in a discussion in a minute or two. But before the opening up the floor for discussion, let's hear what Dimitris has to say. I hope he can cheer us up a little bit. Perhaps not. Who knows?
No, I mean, I try to be a little bit more optimistic than Nathalie. I don't know now which is more idealistic and more realistic, but in my view, the term idealism, which figures in the subject of our discussion today, can have a double meaning. On the one side, it can mean the belief that your ideals can be achieved, often when this does not seem likely to others. And I think in this respect, the European project has always been idealistic and continues to be today idealistic. There is another meaning, which means utopian, that you are realistic and utopian. Also, the European Union, I think, has been utopian and unrealistic in some respects in the recent past. Let me go straight to the subject. Above all, the European Union is a peace project. And don't forget that just a few years ago, in 2012, the European Union was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. And in the decision to give the Nobel Prize, it was said that over 6 decades, the European Union has contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation in the European continent. The fact that now we have a full war in the European continent, it is by itself a very sad and very negative, let's say, development. But on the other side, as Nathalie said, this war is not just about Ukraine, it's about values. And I think because the European Union has reacted quickly and in an unprecedented efficiency to this war, makes me believe that now we become more committed and we remember our values, which for so long have been forgotten. So I think that this war can lead to an acceleration of the European integration, not only in the defense and security and foreign policy domain, but also overall. And I mean, I have been following EU foreign policy since the 80s, and I could never believe, I was asked a few weeks ago, I would never believe that after the 24th of February, the European Union will take so many steps, very important steps. I think that as if you are in a train or a bus and you just look next to you, the person who is sitting next to you, you are not aware of the speed with which the car or the train goes. I think this is what is happening now with us. But if you see what the European Union has achieved in the last, let's say, 5 years, to start with the crisis, the economic financial crisis in 2008, 2009, which of course was a very big shock to the foundations of the EU, but at the end the EU managed to establish some instruments and some mechanisms to overcome this and also to be better prepared to protect the monetary union. Then immediately came the big challenge of the of the Brexit. Many people at that time were saying that this is the beginning of the end, and were betting which country will be the next one to follow the British example. I think on the contrary, what we have seen is that the Brexit made us more conscious of the achievements of the European integration. And this is why some political forces like the extreme right in France with Le Pen was obliged to change their policy, and they don't propose anymore the exit of France from the Eurozone. I think these are extremely positive developments. And then came the COVID. I think the European Union overall reacted in a very efficient way. And I think this pandemic made us aware of the merits of cooperation, that the problems, the challenges of today's world cannot be faced without international cooperation first, and European cooperation second. I think the European institutions reacted in a very satisfactory manner to the COVID, and not only in the sense of the strategy for common vaccination procurement and medical procurement, but also the economic part of the COVID, which was addressed with a historic step of the European Commission going to the international markets with bonds acting on behalf of the member states. This was a historic move. And then when the COVID was about to let us in peace, we had this. I think this last crisis with the war and the invasion in Ukraine is qualitatively different because it makes us aware of the fact that not only we have common interests, but mainly we have common values. And I think this is why we see, and I read the very informative article of Nathalie in the Financial Times about Italy's relations with Russia. And I could say that for my own country, this is even more amazing because Greece used to have extremely close relations with Russia because of history, because of the religion, because of many parameters. And if you see now the way that the Greek public opinion and the Greek government have reacted, it's really amazing, and it shows that people understand that it is now about values. And that's why, till now, the unity is guaranteed. I don't know what will happen in the near future. So I think that in a way, President Putin has provoked, of course it was not his intention, an acceleration of the European integration in many respects, and also a better and closer cooperation between the United States and Europe. And of course, the demand for strategic autonomy of Europe is still there, but this is not necessarily something that is against NATO or the Americans. I think we all understand that, especially with the nuclear threat, we cannot face the nuclear threat alone without the American assistance. And I think there was a perfect harmony in the way that Washington and Brussels have reacted to this international crisis. And I hope and I believe that this will continue. Now, I also, Nathalie referred to her professional, let's say, experience, which is of course, very rich. And I read also her reply to a question by the Foreign Affairs about the NATO expansion. This is the blame game. Is it Russia to be blamed for what is happening, or do we have to blame ourselves that we didn't do enough to integrate Russia in our system? I strongly believe that at least at the first phase, which goes up to the enlargement of 2004, Europe was generally doing everything to assist the transition in the Russian Federation. I myself and my colleagues have been, we had extensive technical assistance projects like Tacit and others. Relations were going very well, and I think that of course after the accession of some eastern countries, Poland, the Baltic states, that had very negative experiences from their relations with Russia, they were more reluctant to. But I still believe that it was at the end Moscow and Putin that decided to take, let's say, another perspective. And although at the beginning he was portraying himself as the Europanizer of Russia, I think that he decided another path. Now, we have been idealistic in the sense of utopian for very long, believing that soft power alone can do the job. And because soft power has been very effective and efficient in the 90s, because the transition from communism to democracy and from state economy to market economy was done in a very peaceful way, thanks to the soft power of the European Union and the perspective and the carrot, if you use, of accession. If there was not this policy of enlargement, I don't think that this transition would have been done without conflicts and wars. Don't forget how many pending issues concerning minorities, borders, and the European Union, the European Commission was heavily involved in the 90s in order to mediate between the different countries and in order to make them behave in a European way to solve their bilateral problems. This is something that was extremely successful. Nobody speaks about it, but I think this gave us, if you use the belief that with soft power we can do everything. But when you have to face totalitarian regimes or personalities like Putin, soft power is not enough. And I think this is one lesson that we learned in one day, on the 24th of February, when in 2008 and in 2014, we didn't react strongly to the Russian illegal acts in Georgia and in Ukraine. okay, it was in a way because of weakness, but also it was because we still believe that there is a way to integrate Russia in our system. We didn't want, to take very tough measures, believing or hoping that at the end we are going to find a modus vivendi with Russia. And because also we are very comfortable with our soft power policy, the Americans were paying for defense. We had also a very big tradition of pacifism, Ostpolitik, and so on. And we thought that with this soft policy instruments, we could go. But now I think nobody has this illusion. I think that the changes that happened in one day, also in the German defense policy and foreign policy, are extremely important for the future. And now for enlargement, because Nathalie asked some very pertinent questions, I think for enlargement, the right answer has been given by her compatriot, the Super Mario Draghi, in the European Parliament. I think that enlargement should go on and should be accelerated, combined with reinforcement of the community of the European institutions in order to be able to face the new complexities of a larger Europe. Now, for migration and asylum, I think that we should not forget that every society has a kind of upper limit of ability to integrate massively, immigrants or refugees. So this is something that we have to keep always in mind. And I think this is something that has been exploited in the last years by the extreme right and the anti-European forces. But I think we are now in a position to find the right balance between respecting our humanitarian, let's say, obligations, but also respecting or being aware of the level of tolerance of a society in terms of numbers of migrants that can be integrated. Energy and defense, I think the new era of more integrated defense and foreign policy will inevitably give more opportunities for a more efficient pan-European energy policy, because the two are linked. And this might also help the transition in the energy sector, which is very important for the climate, which has been stopped now. But I think this is a short-term phenomenon, because now we are in a war. So first of all, we have to, and I think we have to be glad and congratulate ourselves that we managed immediately to assist Bulgaria, and for example, that was cut off in one day by the Russian gas, with determined action of the European partners. Bulgaria has now secured access to gas energy. So I think this is an indication of what we can achieve. And as long as the energy, there are some very important and very important proposals also by Draghi on this respect and by others. So I think that a more integrated energy policy of the European Union will make it easier to face the challenges of energy transition. Okay. Just before finishing, I remember at the beginning of my career, when, because it was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, from the Eastern European countries, it was only Romania that was recognizing the European community at the time. All the others, including the Soviet Union, did not even recognize diplomatically the European Commission and the European Union, or the European communities. And at that time, it was just a tiny unit of 3 people that were covering all the state trading countries, meaning all the communist countries in the world. Just to tell you that the European Union at that time did not have any experience of what was happening in East. It was a mainly NATO and American issue. But I think very quickly, because of the enlargement, the European Union became a foreign policy actor also in this region and managed to realize the reunification of our continent in a peaceful way, which is a very important achievement. So thanks. And
thank you. Thank you very much, Dimitris. Let me just encourage the audience to submit questions. We don't expect them to be expert in any way. Anything you wish to ask our speakers, feel free to do so. It's traditional that I am the one that opens up this Q&A session. So I have two brief questions. The first one for Nathalie, the second one for both of you. I was very stricken, Nathalie, about your concern on whether this can be contained as a frozen conflict or as a Cold War. And immediately the optimist in me started turning the question in its head, which is to say, how could this escalate into an unmanageable war? To me, I'm not a foreign policy expert, of course, but to me, everything I see right now has the makings of a bogged down, contained, but protracted war. Doesn't seem to me to be the beginning of something much bigger, but you know better than me. And I was I wanted to tease you a little bit to tell us what kind of path of escalation do you see? Because that's a very important thing in us trying to think how to stop it, of course, right? Because no one wants the confrontation to go, the war to go out of hand. The second question, and I was having a quick chat with Dimitris before the start of this lecture. And it has to do with Russia itself. I think that looking, I mean, we are based in the UK. I see the news every day. I read a lot about it, but it still seems to me that in the West, we are still not clear what is that Putin wants. Very often the discussion, the debate about Russian aggression, and it is, of course, Russian aggression, let's be absolutely clear about this. It's either because Putin is going mad, he's going old and so on, and he's isolated, or because he's a buddy. Both of them, of course, could well be true. But what we are still, I think, a little bit unclear about is what is behind Russia's actions. Is there a strategic objective? Is it an outcome that Russia would like to see out of all of this? And if there is, what do you think that is? I'm not entirely sure what it is. In fact, I have no clue what it might be, but I would expect Western intelligence and Western analysis of Russia to be able to give us at least an indication of what the Russian objective might be in all of this. So I don't know if, Nathalie, you want to respond to?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And actually, I'll cheat a little bit because in my answer, I'm also going to give you my take to what my answer to your question to Dimitri is. So, because actually my answer to your question to Dimitri would be my answer to you. And I explain what I mean. Now, if Russia's intention, okay, so perhaps, you know, to first also clarify, I think there's, I would agree with you that I cannot today imagine a path in which, you know, Russia, whatever, tomorrow morning decides to drop a nuclear bomb within Ukraine or invades Poland, or I mean, you can imagine escalation either vertically or horizontally going in different directions. And I cannot imagine that happening tomorrow morning, no. But I then connect myself to what I would have answered also had you asked the question that you asked Dimitri to me, by saying that I don't think that Putin's intention is that of saying, well, I will stay put with getting a bit more territory in the Donbass and, you know, having access through Mariupol to Crimea, maybe even going beyond that and trying to capture Odessa. And once I do all that, I don't know how long it's going to take. It's going to take maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. We don't know. But when Russia achieves that, for the sake of argument, that Putin says, okay, fine, game over. Let's have maybe a frozen conflict and let's settle into that steady state. Because I don't think, I mean, I think that the reason why this war is waged is because there is an ideological project behind it. I don't think that geopolitics really helps us very much in understanding what is behind it. I think that this is an imperial project. I think that Putin has, in a sense, made his vision quite clear. I mean, the Ukrainian nation does not exist. And this is part of Russia. Now, if you have, I mean, if you consider yourself to be akin to Vladimir the Great, I mean, you know, on a par with Catherine and the rest of them, well, you're not exactly going to stay put with Donetsk and Luhansk, you know. So the point is that if there were to be a capture of those territories, what makes us think that Putin would stop? I think there are no indications whatsoever that Putin will stop unless he is stopped. Then you get to the question of what does stopping Putin entail? And, you know, well, I mean, obviously it entails defending Ukraine, yeah, but what does the failure of that ideological project, the non-realization of that ideological project entail? And to be honest, I struggle to see a conclusion which does not at some point lead to some sort of collapse of the Russian state. So I don't imagine some sort of democratic revolution magically kind of leading to, I can't see that happening. But, you know, when a regime fails in its, the ideological project that drives it, well, you know, I mean, the repercussions of that, we've kind of seen them before in Russia itself. I mean, you know, this is a state that has collapsed twice in little more than 100 years, when an ideological project replaced another, or one failed, essentially, right? So all of this, I say it because this is not a rosy picture, right? And this is why I can't imagine, I mean, as I said, I cannot imagine some sort of steady state which is based on the territorial compromise, because I don't think that this is why Putin has waged that war. And if we were to end up there, that would entail the failure of an ideological project which would have internal, I don't know when, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, I don't know when, it would have internal repercussions in Russia, which I don't foresee as being wonderfully stable and democratic, but I foresee far more easily being extremely tumultuous and disruptive, with implications on us as well.
Yes, Dimitri?
I agree that it is very difficult to get into the way of thinking of Vladimir Putin. I have read a few years ago a very interesting book by a French analyst. The French title was Dans la tête de Vladimir Putin. I think it has been translated in English, In the Brain of Vladimir Putin. So he is trying to analyze all the ideological background of the Russian president. And his conclusion was that in 2015, when this was written, what Nathalie said, that this is an imperial project. And don't forget that Putin himself has said that the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this first element we have to keep in mind. Second element, he has said that the liberal Western democracy is now dead. And he said this recently. And this has provoked, if you remember, the reaction of Donald Tusk, who at that time was president of the EU Council, who reacted. And so I think it is deeply ideological, first of all, against liberal democracy, that he believes is not able to survive and is not able to face the challenges of the future. And secondly, the regret of the loss of the empire power. In this respect, I agree with Nathalie that he will not compromise with some territorial gains. His objective, and if you wish, the argument that if there was no NATO expansion, he would have not attacked Ukraine, is not correct. If you see exactly the timing of the Russian reaction, the big reaction of Russia happened in 2013-14. I was there in Lithuania during the Lithuanian presidency, waiting for the president of Ukraine to come and sign with all the heads of states and governments of the EU the association agreement. And the president of Ukraine, were told, will come in 2 hours, in 3 hours, in 5 hours. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and all the heads of states were still waiting because the Russians didn't let him. And this is what provoked the big popular reaction in Kiev and the revolution, and not CIA conspiracies and all this bullshit that we hear from the Russian propaganda. So what really Putin is afraid of is a successful Ukraine. Don't forget that in 1990, the per capita income of an Ukrainian was higher than the one of a Polish citizen. And now Poland has 5 times higher per capita income than Ukraine. So what he's afraid is a prosperous democratic Ukraine, who is very close historically to the Russian population, which will give the signal that his regime is. So I think deeply he's more afraid of Europe than from NATO. He knows that the Americans that left Afghanistan in a panic will not go and fight in Russia. I mean, but also his grand design, imperial design, was also the motivation for what he is doing in Syria, what he is doing in Libya, and all this unfortunately didn't ring the bells in the West. We thought that this is just So now, Cold War. I think we cannot have a Cold War because you need an ideology that has some influence. I mean, the communist ideology was very influential at that time, and it was many people in Western countries, and not only, were following this ideology. Now, he has lost completely the war of communication. Nobody, even the countries that are not imposing, sanctions to Russia, they don't agree with what he's doing. So I don't think that. I think it will be a hot war, and for me, the best case scenario is that the Ukrainians, with our help, win the hot war. Perhaps it is too ambitious. I'm not saying that Russia will collapse, but if the Ukrainian resistance continues and is reinforced by us, this might make the choice of retreat for Putin the only solution.
That's very good. Thanks very much, Dimitri. Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tocci and Mr. Kourkoulas. That was so informative for us all. We've been receiving many questions, as you can probably imagine. I'm going to focus on the ones to Nathalie that are quite precise and concise, so hopefully we can get through a few with our time remaining. One from Julius just builds on what Dimitris Kourkoulas was just saying. You mentioned how for Ukraine and the wider EU or NATO bloc, the unifying concept would be its civic values. And Julius asks, what would be the equivalent concept for Russia? which ties neatly to Dimitris' point just now about the potential for a future Cold War or not. And if I could ask a second one just now that has two parts, one from Neil and one from an anonymous attendee. Both pertain to the idea of there being an age of war, which you were talking about, of course, Professor. So how far does the EU need a strategy of war? And in this new age of war, what relationship should the EU seek with China? So there's two main questions there. What's the equivalent concept of civic values within Russia? And secondly, within an age of war, how far does the EU need a strategy of war? And what relationship should the EU have with China? So Professor Tocci, over to you.
And let me, because my battery is running low, so I'm going to put it, hang on, okay, so here I am. Okay, so what would a civic understanding of the nation in Russian mean? Well, essentially it would mean Russian democracy. Is this something that I think is going to happen anytime soon? I wish I could say yes. Unfortunately, I don't see it, and I don't see it because I think that, unfortunately, you know, what Putin represents, his idea of the nation, the ideology that underpins the Kremlin today, is actually quite representative in Russia. And I think that is, you know, something that we have to grapple with. So, you know, to me, a civic understanding of the nation is one which, in which democratic values are embedded. And this is incidentally precisely why I think that the existence of a civic nation is a threat, or represents a threat, to Putin's Russia. Because if Ukraine, that is ethno-linguistically so close to Russia, can prove that it's a civic nation, that it's a democracy, what does it say about Russia? So that is a threat, you know, I mean, that is definitely a threat to Putin. So on this, on the question, you know, do we need a strategy of war? I think on one level, yes, you know, you could say, well, very clearly we're moving into a different phase. I think we're still in the midst of things. So I think it would be unwise if the EU today said, well, now let's engage in a 2-year process to write a new strategy, for instance. I think that this is not the moment for documents. I think this is the moment for action. And in a sense, you know, already in this conversation, we've indicated what are the streams of action that need to be pursued. I don't think you need a strategy to do it. You first need to kind of just do it. And then when you start just doing it, the time will come when that will be strategized, if you see what I mean. So I don't see it as a sort of neat process that starts with writing a document and then leading into action. I think it's part of something, a kind of moving, it's a moving story. At some point, you need to kind of pause and reflect and kind of make sense of it all. But you need to kind of have an idea of where you go, where you've come from, and what is it that you're actually doing before you get to that point. And then on China, and I would actually enlarge the question more broadly. I think that we would not do ourselves any favors to paint the world in a West versus Rest dynamic. I think that's exactly what Putin wants us to do, and that's exactly what he is doing. I think that we have an interest in painting a world which is West versus Russia, Belarus, Syria, Eritrea, North Korea. I mean, if I sort of remember the kind of, you know, votes in that UN General Assembly resolution. And then there's a rest. Now, in that rest, there are many, many shades of gray. Today, if we think of China, China politically very clearly sides with Russia. China economically does not have an interest, in my view, in some sort of third world war military escalation. I think China would have been very happy had Putin won that war in a blitzkrieg in, you know, the first few days, which is probably what Putin told Xi when they met for the Beijing Olympics. It did not go that way, and so I think now China also is struggling. I think we have an interest in, quote unquote, playing on that ambiguity. I don't think we have an interest in pushing anyone, including those that are as close as China is to Russia, completely onto that side. Not to mention, and this is why I say I enlarge it other countries too, not to mention other countries. You know, I think that as Europeans, and this is, I think, something that we can do far better than Americans, that consciously or unconsciously also play into that West versus rest sort of, you know, dynamic. But we as Europeans should be now doubling down in terms of our outreach to African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries, precisely to unpack all those different shades of grey that exist.
Thank you so much, Professor. A couple more questions, if we may.
I just make one comment.
Please do, and then I'll turn to a couple more questions. Yes.
I fully agree that we have to avoid at any price, as Nathalie said, the West versus the rest of the world. But in order, Europe has a lot of know-how how to do it. But in order for this strategy to be successful, we have first of all to persuade our American friends not to do things that will contribute to this West versus the rest of the world. And I think now with Biden, there is an opportunity that we can explain to them that, okay, there are problems with China, there is competition, but we have to avoid this confrontation, which will be detrimental to our European and American interests.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have a couple of questions here. One is from Baris from Surrey in the UK. And Baris asks whether pragmatism means fundamental changes in the EU's identity as a global actor, or is it merely a new way of doing things? So is it an identity question, or is it simply a new way of doing things? We have a question from Aaron, asking whether, this touches upon what we were just talking about, whether the EU project is now forced to structure security with deterrence at the heart of it. Is this the new framing that the EU needs to take forward? So does security need to be re-understood with deterrence at the heart of it? And then finally, if we can, a very contemporary topic as well, Yanis asks how the EU should handle the situation in Transnistria, and how would any potential reunification of Moldova with Romania be received in Moscow and Brussels? So some big questions for us in the space of a few minutes, but Professor, if I could turn to you and see what your reflections are of some or all of those.
Okay, so pragmatism, is it a way of acting or is it an identity? I think that it is, because it's a form of action. In the case of the EU, it's an identity, and I explain what I mean by that. At times, our normative coating has very often become a very convenient excuse for inaction. And if pragmatism is a way of acting, it is a way of acting. It means that you know, the world at times is a messy place, and if you act, you necessarily have to be pragmatic about it, especially given that, exactly, you know, you're not you know, whatever, the global superpower, the only hegemon that actually can simply impose its normative view for the world. I mean, the US tried, but it kind of failed, right? So, you know, the EU by definition would never even be able to try that. So I think a way of acting pragmatically is a way of acting which it is identity shaping for the EU, given that we so often conveniently not act and hide behind all sorts of, we're divided as member states. And I mean, we come up with all sorts of reasons why we don't act. Is deterrence the new name of the game here? Well, it's obviously, I would say, NATO's old new name of the game. I think that this war has, if you think of it, the end of Afghanistan, the Afghanistan sort of NATO presence in Afghanistan, coupled with only 6 months sort of distance, war in Ukraine, marks very starkly the end of the out of operation era, which was already ending, but in a very kind of plastic way. And here we are back into an age of deterrence on steroids, because this is not a Cold War, but it's a hot war. So I think it's very much a NATO story. Is it also an EU story? I think the EU story is a story of protection. I don't think it's a story of deterrence. I don't think that the way in which we will kind of take on greater responsibility on defense will take the form of deterrence, to be honest. I do think, though, that precisely because, be it the United States, be it NATO, be it others, will not be doing many things in other parts of the world, as I said, that out of area era is over. We as Europeans have to be ready to take on a little bit more flak when it comes to, what to do in Libya and what to do in whatever, I mean, you can imagine trillion different parts of the world. Transnistria, very difficult to answer that question, because it's very difficult, I think, at this point in time. Earlier in response to Dimitri, I said, I don't quite imagine a kind of, Russian march on Poland or on the Baltic countries. Can we really exclude that in a matter of days, weeks, there isn't Moldova being, through Transnistria, being sort of swept into this war? Maybe because this is what Putin wants, maybe because this is a means of getting Odessa, I don't know. So it's very, given that that is something that you cannot rule out, unfortunately, it's very difficult to think through what our policy towards Moldova and Transnistria would be in response. I think it really fundamentally depends on whether Moldova is going to be kind of, pulled into this war.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Kourkoulas, do you have a brief response to some of Professor Tocci's points there?
Just on Moldova and Transnistria, I'm not an expert on this region, but my impression is that Putin does not really need to walk into Moldova. He controls already Transnistria. I don't know, I'm afraid he might try to take, and of course he will destroy Odessa, which will be say, a tragedy for such a nice city. But I don't think for all this he really needs, but as I said, I'm not a military expert on this region, so this is what I've heard from discussing with some people.
And if I may conclude with a final question to you, Professor Tocci, which is from an attendee based in India. The writer has clearly shown a lot of familiarity and expertise with realist theory, and I'll kind of amalgamate those two questions there from Falguni, based in India, which is simply, Professor, whether you could reflect on the extent to which these events have developed our understandings of, say, realist thought, and also what the roles of individuals are within these events, and whether it changes our thinking or the thinking of realists regarding the role of individual leaders. So some more conceptual reflections, if you could, just before we conclude.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think the unfortunate thing that I see happening, and this is true particularly of American sort of, international relations, which of course, where of course realism tends to be very dominant, is that there's the tendency amongst realists to use a inevitably particular theoretical lens to understand what is it that is happening, which I think has failed to capture essentially what is going on. I think it's far clearer for us as Europeans to see what's going on, but you don't see that self-questioning amongst especially American realists. And I cite this because Dimitri earlier was mentioning the little foreign affairs sort of paragraph that I did. And regardless of what I wrote, I found it very interesting, I mean, to look at that list. And in that list, you have plenty of realists, yeah? I think I was, as a European and as an Italian, maybe sort of probably with the sensibility towards these questions quite similar to both Dimitris. I kind of used to think, well, maybe indeed, later enlargement, maybe we didn't take Russia's security concerns kind of, seriously enough. This war has made me change my mind big time, big time. I don't see that self-questioning amongst American realists that I would have expected. I don't know whether it's because they're on the other side of the Atlantic. I don't know why, but I find it quite striking how, and I say this because, I think we're here in a situation where it would be tragic if we simply use selectively the evidence that we see to reconfirm our own theoretical assumptions. I think that this is really a time for very profound self-questioning. Otherwise, we end up, earlier I cited the paradox of, the total failure of scholars to predict the end of the Cold War, and then here they are next day, assuming that they know the way in which history will end. I mean, let us not kind of make the same mistake again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'll pass back over now to Professor Dimitris Kourkoulas, who's going to conclude this session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks very much to both our speakers. In many ways, I feel very sad that we do this online. I would much rather have done this in Manchester. I promise you that there will be another opportunity for both of you to come to the university and be treated to a Mancunian pub or something. I cannot promise you very good food, but I can promise
you a good drink.
I can promise you a good drink and a reasonable beer. It's been a great pleasure listening to your views. Thanks to the audience as well for staying so late. The recording of this lecture will come out shortly. If you want, you can visit our website. There are recordings of all of our previous events, and I think that a lot of you will enjoy that. There is already some banter on the chat about Italian food and British food. Let's not go there. We'll make Brexit even worse if we start pointing to these things. But I hope that all of you have a good afternoon, and thanks very much indeed for joining us for today.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.